Look at you, hacker. A pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors. How can you challenge a perfect, immortal machine?
Now, it's time for Video Games Weekly. Industry news, reviews, what's great, what's garbage, everything you need to know about video games. Now, along with Andy Reiner, here's the fans, Paul Charchian.
Welcome to Video Games Weekly. I'm Paul Charchian. My co-host, as always, Reiner from Game Informer and GameInformer.com. Editor-in-Chief, Reiner.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, great to talk to you. Good to have you back. There's some nice new news that's come out today. I want to talk about Sony finally lifting the veil on some key elements of their next VR project, Reiner.
Yeah, I didn't see it coming, especially just kind of a blog post with no images, no gameplay, just details.
Yeah, weird, right? Weird way to sort of sneak out some of the information about what's coming in the next PS5 VR headset. They told us they were going to have one. But great to have some information coming out now, which is really nice. And you just reviewed a remake of the first game I ever bought on the original Nintendo system.
Wow, that's going back.
When I was, the year is 1986. When did the NES come out, Reiner?
85, right?
Okay.
The Crash was in 83. Yep. The Atari Crash, remember that? The great video game
Atari Crash. Well, yeah. So I think it was probably 86. I'm at Target. They've got it on the shelf at Target, and I had never heard of it before, the Nintendo system. But I'm looking at the back of the box, and I'm like, oh my God, this looks unbelievable. I mean, it was such a big jump from the previous console might have been ColecoVision. And so I went home, gathered all my money, got the NES, and I think it had a pack-in game, and then I think I also bought Ghosts and Goblins, is what I remember, that being my very first game. Brutally hard, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, that's, every jump, every reflex matters, right? Like you can't be a hair off in this game. No.
So that goes way back. And now we've got a remastered version, or totally not remastered, a totally new version, right? And Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection.
Right, it's a love letter to those original games. In fact, the same director that created the original games, Takura Fujiwara, is back on this one to direct. This is basically a sequel to the Super Nintendo game. So going all the way back to 1991. There's been a couple handheld games. There was a PSP game and a couple iOS games after that. But this is like a true sequel to that 1991 Super Nintendo game, and it feels like it. It feels like you've gone back in time. You don't have Mode 7 effects like on the Super Nintendo, but it does kind of feel like more of Ghouls and Ghosts, as it was called. And then I even was reminded of Super Castlevania 4 at times, where I was just like, this is just such an homage and just a return to a style of game that I didn't know I wanted back. But once I started playing, I was like, I just adore these types of games.
Oh, fantastic. I love it. We'll dive into that in a little more detail here momentarily. Let me also just mention, coming up next segment, Nick Nelson is a local author. He covers the Twins for, actually, I'm not sure which outlet. I think Twins Daily. In fact, I'm 99% sure it's Twins Daily. But he also wrote a book called Versus. It covers 25 historic head-to-head battles in the video game industry throughout history. Super fun book, Reiner. I know you're familiar with it.
Yep.
I am too. I've gone through it. I read it I read it during the middle of the creation process, and then read it again when it was finished. And a super fun read. And so we'll talk about Versus with Nick Nelson and some of the key battles that shaped the video game industry coming up in a few minutes. Next segment. Okay, back to Ghosts and Goblins. So is it still going to be a side-scrolling game, and we're not going 3D at this stage, right?
Nope, and it's side-scrolling. The second you start playing, it feels like an old Super Nintendo game, right? Like you jump, your jump isn't very precise. You know, you can't
Yeah.
really move him once he's going. And then you can shoot in 4 directions, you know, with the lance that he throws, or, you know, you can pick up other power-ups like, you know, the Hellfire, you know, you can rain that down on enemies. But it almost looks like a storybook come to life, where everything almost appears like it's drawn with pencil. And it just has a style of its own. And when they move, it almost looks like they're like stop motion animated to a degree, right? Like every movement is very precise, very calculated. And yeah, it just looks gorgeous. You know, the enemies aren't that inspired. You know, you're going against a skeleton. You know, there's only so much you can do with that in terms of a design. But somehow the backgrounds and these enemies really pop off the screen. And the brilliance of this is the level design. Every level uses that very basic moveset in Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, yet they challenge you in very different ways. And it's very fair. Like, you're going to die repeatedly, right? You're just going to be reduced to a pile of bones over and over, knocked into a pit. They always have an enemy flying right at the perfect time and spot when you're jumping, and they hit you into the pit. You know, you see him just kind of arc over. You're like, no, and there he goes, right? But it's very fair in the checkpointing and the skill required to get from one checkpoint to the next. And you feel relieved when you hit that next checkpoint. But once you hit it, you don't know what's going to be coming next. The gameplay is going to shift again and give you a different challenge again. And that's just, you know, all the way through. Every level that you play through has different dynamics. It can be brutally hard. And when you die repeatedly, it'll tell you, do you want to bump the difficulty down? So it's classic in being...
Oh, I like that. Okay.
Yeah, it's classic in being beautiful and brutal. But at the same time, Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection allows you to make progress at your own skill level and desired speed, right? Like, if you just don't want to bang your head against one challenge, you could lower the difficulty and get through it and then bump it back up. They even have something in the game called a magic metronome, which allows you to slow time so you can get an advantage that way, right? Like, if you got to go across these crumbling platforms very quickly, you could slow time and really give yourself an edge, get that extra second to think about your jump. After you finish the game, the game is relatively short, right? You can beat it in a couple hours. But like all the old Ghosts and Goblins games, it rearranges things on your next playthrough. There's more to see. The levels almost feel distinct, different challenges, different things to experience as you're going along. At that point, the magic metronome, you're a skilled player now. You already beat it. You could speed up time and make the game even harder for you.
Is Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, are we talking about Cuphead difficulty?
No, not even close to that. I would say halfway to Cuphead. Okay, yeah, maybe halfway there.
Right. So it's still reasonably accessible, which is important. Cuphead for me, that's over the top hard, and that's I don't need Cuphead and Celeste in my life. I've got enough failure in my life that I don't need that much more failure.
And you can even go beyond this and lower the difficulty again to a difficulty they call Page, where if you die, you instantly respawn where you died, and you could just keep making progress. So you could just fly through the game.
Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, what systems is it out for?
Just Switch. So this is a Switch exclusive right now. And
wow,
like, feels fantastic on the Switch. And what I was going to say, Charch, is if you need assistance and you have someone in your household that can pick up another Joy-Con or whatever, you could play the game cooperatively, where the second player plays these 3 ghosts that you can rotate through. Each ghost has a different ability, like being able to make a glowing ghost bridge over a gap that you're having troubles with. Or another ghost can just outright pick you up. And not just pick you up to lift you over a gap, but pick you up to give you a better vantage point to shoot at a boss or an enemy that you need to take down.
Oh, wow.
And the third ghost can put a shield around you to protect you. So it's a really clever idea for a second player. They're not getting the difficulty. They're not dying like you are. They're not experiencing Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection the way it should be played. But it does give the game an extra element that does cut down that difficulty. If you don't want to lower the difficulty level, you can have another player come in and help you make progress.
I love that. And there are a lot of games that I think could really be helped by having a second player that isn't necessarily a second player, but just somebody who can sprinkle an aid. And there have been other games that have done it. One of my favorites is Child of Light from like 6 years ago, but it turned into one of the great father-daughter gaming events that I had with my daughter, because she could just pick up the other controller and just help, and didn't have to go through all of the challenges of the regular game.
Yeah, and I can't recommend Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection enough. I was amazed just how much it kept changing from one platforming sequence to the next action one. Like it's just so dynamic in its design that by the time you finish it, it's just wow. Like that basic moveset was put through the ringer in such clever ways. You don't often see that in games like this, and you could tell it was lovingly made with a lot of care. It's beautiful, and just an unexpected hit, for Switch, another exclusive that just out of nowhere that I can't recommend enough.
And the final score you gave it?
9 out of 10.
9 out of 10. You can read the full review for Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection at GameInformer.com. Reiner, I want to shift over to the news that came out earlier this morning from Sony about their VR headset for the Ps5. And you're an advocate for VR. I'm a huge advocate for VR, so we track this very closely, and Sony acknowledged years ago that there would be a PS5 VR headset, and we are just now getting our first information on it. We don't know really technical specifications yet, but we do have a fair number of bullet points on this. Number one, and this is a biggie, it's going to have one cord. You remember what it took to set up get the PS4 headset rocking? Oh, geez.
It's like building a Lego set just to get that connected.
No kidding. So we're down to one cord. Presumably you'll just plug it into the front USB port of your PS5. Done. So that's critical. They've confirmed it'll have better resolution, which we knew it would, because the resolution in the PS4 VR headset was about as bad as anything on the market. So we knew the resolution would be better, and we knew that the PS5 could push far better resolution. They say it'll have better tracking, Reiner, which I don't doubt. Now, what we don't know is the tracking going to be internal or external. And by that, what I mean is the PS4's tracker was the camera. Yep. And so you had to have it was external tracking. You had to have this camera that had to be able to see it. But where the whole industry is shifting is to internal tracking, like the Oculus Quest, where the cameras are built into the headset, and the headset sees the room instead of the camera seeing the headset. Way, way better. And that means that you don't have to, it's one less thing you have to futz with, one less thing that you have to buy and have try to work. And so we really do want the internal camera for the tracking.
Yeah, the fact that they didn't say that makes me think it might have a camera again. It just says improved tracking, right? Yeah. But no mention of camera-free tracking. You'd think that would be a bullet point they'd want to hammer home.
Yeah, you would. This is a biggie. If I'm reading this correctly, they're going to have a VR-specific controller. I am reading it correctly. A VR-specific controller. So we're going to have a new controller, and they say it'll have some of the same things that you love about your current PS5 controller built into this VR-specific controller. This is a really big deal potentially.
Yeah, I'm guessing that's going to be that kind of haptic feedback that you're getting, and the tightening of the triggers. All that stuff that really makes the DualSense controller such a breakthrough for PlayStation 5. That would be awesome to have that in VR. I wonder if it's going to have, if it is using a camera again, if it's going to have kind of the Move lights, like the PlayStation Move was the controllers you would use in PlayStation
I hope
4
not.
VR. That's something that they could potentially have, some kind of way to better track you again. But we'll have to see. They're not showing us anything right now. It's all just bullet points.
It is. Now it'll have to, Reiner, the controller's going to have to be two separate grips. I mean, one of the downsides I always thought about the PS4 VR was how many games people ended up playing with the PS4 controller in their hand. And now you've really lost some of the immersion of VR. And VR is all about immersion. And I need to have my controllers. I need to have one in each hand. So I'm moving my hands independently. And the Move controllers let you do that. But so many times I see people just playing with the regular old controller. And it really took away some of what made, VR special. And I got to believe this new controller will have one thing in each hand.
I'm hoping that it's a dual sense that just splits in two. Exactly a dual sense that you sever in the middle and you have both of them in your hands. And when you're done playing VR, you can put them together and use it for your other
snap
PlayStation
them
5
together.
game. Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
Oh,
I don't know if
that
that's
would be
possible
great.
with that tech, but why not?
Yeah, I don't either. Well, here's why not. Then they can't sell you another controller because that's
you would
second
need
controller.
Yeah, you would need the one that splits in two for VR.
I would need it for VR, but then I'd also have a second controller for my PS5.
That is true. Yeah.
And they're not going to sell me one. So maybe that's a reason not to. Now, they say it's not coming in 2021, so at least a year away from the PS5 VR headset. And I bet it's more like a couple years.
I bet it's 2022 and we see it this fall and then maybe next spring, next summer.
Yeah.
Here's hoping. I really want to see what they're doing. And I want to, given that time frame, I want to see how great that resolution boost is going to be. Is it going to be, on par with what's out there in the PC space right now, kind of the leaders in VR, or are they going to go beyond that and really just make this future proof?
Well, resolution is so important to VR because it puts you in the game, and it's all about immersion, as I mentioned earlier. Better resolution is really important, and there are also people who get what's called screen door effect, where they can just see between the lines between the pixels, and getting that resolution to change so people don't have that is really important. Do you have I don't know if they're gonna have a fancy name for this. I mean, there was no real name for the PS4's VR headset, was there? I mean, it was
just PlayStation VR.
Yeah, so this PlayStation VR. So is this
PlayStation VR 2 or PlayStation 5 VR?
Yeah, something like that, I suppose. Yeah. So we'll find out. Well, I'm sure we'll find out more in the months ahead. But some exciting news, and great to find out a little bit more about what the plan is for PlayStation owners for VR. I'm very excited. When we come back, Nick Nelson is the author of Versus, a 25-year look at the evolution of video games as in the form of head-to-head battles, which is really fun. We'll talk to Nick coming up next. Welcome back to Video Games Weekly. I'm Paul Charchian. With me now is local author Nick Nelson. You know Nick Nelson from Twins Daily, but Nick's also a hardcore video game nerd. Yeah. And the author of Versus, 25 head-to-head battles that shaped the evolution of video games. Now, you were nice enough, Nick, to sort of keep me in the loop from the beginning on this, and it was great to see a 2-year development process, and congratulations on getting to the finish line. Anybody who gets a project like this done, I always have great respect for. Congratulations to getting to the end, and versusbook.com is where people can get more information on it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And thank you for having me on the show. It's a great honor.
Tell listeners a little bit about how you identified the 25 head-to-head battles that shaped the history of video games.
Well, I came up with the idea for the book, kind of taking this lens of looking through video game history as a series of head-to-head clashes, basically, that have kind of led from one thing to another and gotten us where we're at today. And honestly, it came kind of naturally as I started to put the pieces together and figured out the story I wanted to tell. So it weaves through a lot of different aspects of how gaming has evolved, a lot of the creators, a lot of the different genres. And a lot of it was kind of stuff that I wanted to read about and explore, but I thought it came together pretty nicely.
So, Nick, your book starts going all the way back to Chapter 1, Pong versus the Pretender. So we're all the way back to Pong, the earliest video games, and then you get into Space Invaders versus Asteroids, Pac-Man versus Ms. Pac-Man. By the way, Ms. Pac-Man is the correct answer to that. How did you decide what you were going to choose in your head-to-head battles?
Yeah, so, I kind of came up with this idea for this lens that I wanted to tell the story through, this series of successive head-to-head clashes that I thought each one would sort of tell a new step of the story of video gaming's evolution. And as it started to come together, the topics really came together pretty naturally. I thought there was a sort of a theme that was easy to follow, and I picked things that I wanted to write about, but also things that really fit well with helping shape that evolution and follow the journey.
Yeah, some of them I think are a little more straightforward, like console versus PC. That's been a debate in the gaming community for 30 years. But also, I like that you got into more esoteric stuff like pixels versus polygons, Will Wright versus an ending, which you don't get in his stuff. And that to me, I thought it was great that you sort of went outside of what would be maybe some of the normal thinking of these head-to-head battles throughout the history of video games.
Yeah, I thought getting a little more abstract with it would create a little more flexibility to tell some of those stories that aren't necessarily as straightforward as Nintendo versus Sega. Sometimes it's a creator versus a suppressive force, whether it's Shigeru Miyamoto overcoming conventions, or like you mentioned, Will Wright realizing that games don't necessarily need to end. It doesn't have to be a win-loss ultimatum. And the book really kind of talks about how those developments and changes helped really affect everything that came after.
A chapter in Versus that I think will ring true for a lot of our listeners: Madden versus 2K. Now, for many people, we remember 2K very, very fondly. Dreamcast era, great games, Randy Moss on the cover. And then there's EA with Madden. They've had the exclusive rights now for a decade, and you get what you get. Talk to people a little bit about what went into that chapter as you looked at the head-to-head battle between Madden and 2K.
Yeah, that was a fun one to write because it's so vivid in my memory, that period of time. A lot of this, part of the book and my reason for writing it and why I really enjoyed it and think it has a good perspective is that, I was born in 1985, right around within a few days of the NES and Super Mario Brothers coming to America. So I've really kind of grown up with video games and matured alongside them. And yeah, when NFL 2K came along from Visual Concepts, it was right when the Vikings and Randy Moss were exploding as this super exciting offensive machine, and Randy Moss was on the cover of the game, and it was just this tremendous game. I mean, it got huge reviews and sort of shook Madden from its perch at the top there. And I think the development of EA going out and buying the exclusive rights to NFL licensing and basically, taking over a monopoly on the system is sort of speaks to what's wrong and what's holding back sports video games a lot of the time, when you don't have that competition, that versus, and these two sides that are challenging each other to one up. So I don't know. I haven't really played a Madden game in a long time. They're just not doing much for me anymore.
We're talking to Nick Nelson, author of Versus, a historic look at the history of video games in the framework of battles, 25 unique battles. This one, Madden versus 2K. Back in 1997, Sega bought Visual Concepts, the company that had done 2K, puts it on the Dreamcast. EA never goes to the Dreamcast. And I wonder if part of the rationale was that they didn't want to support the Dreamcast because they had 2K and they didn't want to put Madden on the Dreamcast. And ultimately, not having EA really hurt the Dreamcast.
Yeah, we looked back at that story quite a bit in that chapter. And I mean, the whole backstory of it is very interesting. EA was once upon a time Sega's best friend. They partnered with Sega back in the Genesis days, and those sports games, NHL 94, that era of sports games on the Genesis was really what helped it compete, and for a very short period of time, as we cover in Chapter 10, surpassed Nintendo, which some people thought was unthinkable at one point. But yeah, when they turned their backs and decided not to get on board with the Dreamcast, that was a tough one, and helped lead to Dreamcast's unfortunate destiny, which was also covered in the book.
Yeah, and the Dreamcast was great, Nick, and it did a lot of firsts on the Dreamcast, and it was powerful at its time. But at the end of the day, it just didn't have the games that a lot of people wanted to play, which was kind of sad, unfortunately. Let's talk a little bit about a couple other chapters that I find particularly interesting. You've got a whole chapter on Miyamoto early in the book, and you frame it up as Miyamoto versus convention. Tell people what you mean by that. And it perfectly timed, by the way. Here we are, 35th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda.
Yeah, right. I mean, convention, is it's the way things are done. It's best practices. It is the comfortable fallback, and I think a lot of the time it is a destructive force for humanity that stifles innovation. When people are just trying to do things the way that people think that they've been done well in the past. You're not going to break any new ground. So I think Shigeru Miyamoto, more than maybe anyone else in the history of video games, is someone who bucked convention and set a standard for bucking convention. And hey, The Legend of Zelda, which, yes, we're celebrating its 35th anniversary, is a great example. I mean, when you started that game with no sword in your hand and no specific direction of where to go, that was earth shattering, because all of a sudden it's not holding your hand. You got to figure it out on your own.
Yeah.
And now, you know, you look at Breath of the Wild, and that concept has been taken to such a huge evolution. It's really cool to see.
And the Zelda series really ushered in action RPGs. You know, we had some role-playing games, but they were almost all static turn-based stuff. We really didn't have sort of a classic great action RPG before Zelda. And of course, that ended up being a formula that people loved.
Yeah. I mean, some people would argue that Zelda is not even an RPG. I mean, because it doesn't have that classic standard turn-based pace and everything like that. But I do love the way it brought those action elements into the genre, and obviously, it's something that stood the test of time.
Yeah, no doubt about that. Let's talk for a little bit. Well, let's stay with Japan for a little while. You have a chapter called Kojima versus Konami. Tell people a little bit about that battle.
So I think that's, you know, in recent video game history, there's been no more public battle, I guess, in the industry than Konami clashing with the company that raised him, Konami, who helped him develop Metal Gear and some of his truly, I mean, Konami is a one-of-a-kind figure and auteur in the video game industry. And I think that chapter, it explores the story of what happened between those two sides as well as we know it, between all the gag orders and everything. But I think what it explores is a deeper storyline that's very essential to the future of video games, which is there still going to be room for someone like Kojima and his very grand AAA visions of these games that are incredibly expensive to produce, super high scale, super high scope. Konami basically decided that it just wasn't worth the squeeze when they can produce mobile games and stuff like that for so much cheaper. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with these big budget AAA games. You see sort of disasters playing out like Cyberpunk, and you wonder how many more companies are going to be willing to invest to that level in them.
Yeah, it's really hard, right? And especially when mobile, as much as we sort of roll our eyes, as real gamers roll our eyes at mobile gaming, just the reality is we got our phones in our pockets all the time, and people still like playing simple, easy to digest games, and that's a lot of what mobile games give us, and there's a ton of money in it. I was talking to my doctor yesterday, and he told me he's got a mobile game that he plays, and he pays $5 every single day to speed the acceleration of building something he needs for his clan. $5 every single day.
Yeah, I mean, the pay as you play and the microtransactions are where the money at, and a lot of companies are starting to see that. That's for sure.
That is for sure. Last segment, we talked about the new PlayStation 5 VR headset. Sony just revealing new information about it. We're talking to Nick Nelson. He is the author of Versus Book, versusbook.com. And I love VR, Nick. I'm a huge proponent. Talk to me a little bit about the VR versus the future chapter, and why are those things versus? Isn't VR part of the future?
Well, I think what we were trying to establish there was whether VR is the future, or how big of a role it's going to play. It's going to play some role. I think we all agree. And there's definitely, I've had my skepticism about VR, and I think there definitely has been some, but it's taken some steps. I got to say, I just got an Oculus Quest 2 a week ago. That thing is sweet. I mean, it's changing my view on VR, because the wireless, the ease of using it, and some of the slick kind of user enhancements they've made are really taking it to the next level. So I'm changing my opinion a little bit.
All right. So are we going to get a new version of the book?
Yeah, we might have to have a follow-up that changes the last chapter.
I'd be in favor of that. The Oculus Quest really is a game changer in that you're bringing VR to people, good VR to people who don't have a $2,000 gaming PC to use for, and it's untethered. I mean, it's done so many things right, and it really brings VR to the masses, and it's been a huge success. What games are you playing on your Oculus Quest 2?
I've only begun to dabble, but last night I started getting into Beat Saber, and I feel like it's probably going to take over my life for a little while. And it's, I get a little workout and everything too. The one thing that I have a hard time getting by is just sort of this going into a different world and isolating myself from everything else. But, I think augmented reality and sort of multiplayer experiences and stuff like that could help solve for that. I think that's kind of one of the things still holding it back.
Yeah, there are tons of multiplayer games and VR chat rooms. In fact, there's a product called VR Chat where you just, it's basically just chat rooms. You just go talk to people. And Nick, it's the pandemic. All we do is isolate. You've been conditioned for isolation for 1 year.
Yeah, I can't argue with that.
Yeah. I recommend as the next game, In Death. It is fantastic, archery-based game.
Awesome. I'm going to check that out.
One of my favorites, In
Cool.
Death. Yeah, it's very, very good. All right, let's hit on the chapter that I am in. It's not all about me. This is your book. Again, it's Nick Nelson. The book is called Versus. You can get more information at Versus Book. Will Wright versus The Ending. What made you decide to do a chapter on games that don't have to have an ending?
Well, I think one of the pivotal turning points in the history of video games was when they went from, because in the early days, by necessity, it was very ephemeral. Arcade games were about playing until your quarter, as long as your quarter lasted, and a lot of the early games were not really capable of doing anything beyond a very, short start and start over kind of mechanism. What Will Wright brought to the table, which was really interesting, was a grander concept of, if I'm going to build something right now and it's going to be here tomorrow, and I don't necessarily have an end goal. I'm just going to manage this thing. And I think that's really taken on in video games in a lot of different forms. So yeah, Paul, I really appreciate you taking part in that chapter and sharing your story of possibly becoming the first person ever to buy a consumer copy of SimCity. A great story that Chart shared in that chapter 9. So recommend that people check that out. But yeah, and so telling the story of how he started with SimCity and then it transformed into The Sims, which really gained a lot of traction and became for a while the top selling PC game of all time.
Yeah, an amazing story. And Will Wright's really dropped sort of off the face of the earth. I don't know entirely what's happened with him, but not doing anything that I know of. I looked to see if he had a Twitter account. No. And I don't know how you reach Will Wright, even if you want to at this stage.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, a lot of these guys had their big heyday and they've kind of somewhat gone into hiding, I guess. He had definitely had a very out. I'm sure he's working on some sort of grand idea because he always is.
Yeah, you'd assume that's the case. He tried to launch Spore. I think that was the last big thing that he did, and it just didn't quite click, unfortunately. But
it was
too
big and too grand, I think. I mean, this whole concept of evolving an organism from single cell to interstellar space travel, it's a lofty idea.
It's a lot. That's very big. What I remember about that first edition of SimCity, it was on a Macintosh, and I was working at Software Etc., and we had a demo Mac that just ran. And so I would put SimCity in and just leave it running. And people would sit down and they'd be like, oh, what is this? It looked weird. You'd never seen anything like it. And they'd sit down and then they're there for an hour playing SimCity. And the next thing you know, they're buying a copy of a game they didn't know anything about moments before.
Yeah, I mean, it's an addictive concept, this whole idea of running your own town as the mayor and being able to manage all the infrastructure. I mean, it sounds really boring, honestly. I think what you said in the book was that you looked at the cover and it looked like a civics class, and it does. And that's kind of what they were up against, and that's what Will Wright was up against. But once people started playing it, as you mentioned, it was very infectious. Yeah,
it really was infectious. And City Skyline is the current reigning champ of that kind of game, and it's a great game. And it's just a little sad that SimCity hasn't evolved and that EA has ultimately let that whole thing languish. Nick, we're out of time, but thanks so much. We encourage people to check out Versus, the book, at versusbook.com. They can follow you at Twitter. I think you're Nick Nelson MN. Is that right?
That is correct.
Nick Nelson MN. Thanks a lot for joining the show, Nick.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Charge.
Welcome back to Video Games Weekly. Paul Charchino Reiner with you. Last week, Reiner, we talked about this crazy hit game called Valheim. This is the low resolution survival combat crafting game that has gone crazy on PC. It just hit last week we were saying, wow, it hit over 300,000 concurrent users. Well, they now hit a 500,000 concurrent mark on Steam. It's just the 5th game in the history of video games to have a 500,000 concurrent users on Steam, and the only one to do so while maintaining an overwhelmingly positive review score on Steam.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
The history of games. History of Steam, I should say,
yeah.
Which goes back, what, decades now?
20 years. So, you know, and for PC gamers, you know, it may as well be the history of games. It's stunning. This is 5 guys, Reiner. 5 guys that have been able to do this. It's crazy. Now, to add some more context to how quickly Valheim has reached this 500,000 concurrent players, it took CSGO 3.5 years to reach 500,000 concurrent users. It took Valheim 2 weeks. Dota 2 took 2 years of growth to get to 500,000 users. PUBG, which the game that reached the highest peak by a fair margin, took over 3 months to reach this level. And then recent hits like Fall Guys and Among Us, they never even hit a half a million on Steam. So it is amazing that right now this game has got this much traction and a positive review percentage of 96%. Yeah. You know better than most how cynical gamers can be. To get 96% of gamers to agree that a game is good, it's staggering.
They're loving it, and I'm sure that dev team of 5 people is out shopping for cars right now, maybe, or some houses, you know, Malibu, who knows?
How about new employees? Mansions. They might need some of those.
Yeah, bring in some new people to enjoy those riches that they're probably swimming through right now, like Scrooge McDuck. You know, like it's you rarely see a hit like this this fast, and for it to be such a small team, I just can't even imagine what's going through their minds right now. They just must be high-fiving nonstop.
It's you almost never see this, and it's very exciting. And you've got Dan Tax got some stories about Valheim on the website. We encourage you to go to GameInformer.com where you can learn more about it. Diablo 2 is being remastered by Blizzard, Reiner.
Yeah, we just had Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, and now this is Diablo 2 Resurrected. So that is kind of the song and dance this year. Everything's being resurrected.
It is. It's 20 years old. 20. I remember where I was when I bought my copy of Diablo 2 at Ridgedale and Minnetonka. And I remember, you know, it was a huge deal. We had waited so long to get Diablo 2. I want to say Diablo 2 is like 8 years after Diablo 1, something like that.
Yeah. And that's the game people played, you know, the next 15 years straight.
They did.
They didn't care about anything else. They just wanted more Diablo.
Diablo 2 was so good. So was Diablo 1. But Diablo 2, you know, everything that was good in Diablo 1 got better. So what's going to be new and different in this version of Diablo 2, Reiner? We've got 4K resolution, 3D physically based rendering, all new animations, lighting, textures, effects. All the cinematics and the cutscenes have been completely remade, shot for shot. And looking at the trailer, which, by the way, the trailer's been out for like 3 days, and it's got 1 million views for Diablo 2's Resurrected. The graphics still aren't going to blow you away. It's still faithful, very faithful, I think, to Diablo 2. And there was part of me that was sort of hoping it'd go through a major reskinning. But I think they're trying to also make it appeal to the people who wanted it to look and feel more like Diablo 2.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing. You know, just keeping it consistent. You know, people kind of lost their minds when there was bright colors in Diablo 3.
Yes.
So, you know, kind of sticking with what's classic works. It's being developed by Vicarious Visions, a team that was rolled into Blizzard recently. I've always liked the games that studio makes, and I think, you know, taking it away from the Diablo 4 team that's currently pumping away at that, I think is a good thing. So we're going to have 2 Diablos in development at once, which a Diablo overload is not going to be a bad thing. I'll tell you that much. I love these games. I'm one of those guys who's fills out the map in each dungeon. You know, I cannot leave that dungeon until every little line on the map is filled in. And it's playing cooperatively with friends. It's going to be on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, obviously PC, but also Switch, which is a nice surprise. I did not expect that on day one, but it seems like Blizzard is all in on Switch. Overwatch 2, which, by the way, was just announced, is not coming in 2021.
I know.
That'll be a hopefully 2022 game, is also coming to Switch, right? So you know, I think Blizzard's all in on that, and that's a great thing because they make some of the best games out there.
This new version, Diablo 2 Resurrected, well, it's a new version of the old game, is it's going to include the expansion, Lord of Destruction, so that'll be in there as well. You mentioned co-op play, and this to me is the one big bummer. They're not finding a way to get couch co-op into the game. It'll have online co-op, but it will not have couch co-op. And that to me is the one really, really big bummer out of this news for Diablo 2 Resurrected.
That's where we're going as an industry, a video game industry, is everything's online. You know, with streaming the way it is now, you know, maybe that means you can just connect via your phone and have a controller on your phone. You know, that's the new version of couch co-op maybe in the next 5 years. But they really want everyone to have their own, you know, full screen and be able to play that way. And that makes sense, right? Like I get it, but there is an element of gaming that's being lost, not being able to just plug in 4 controllers on a screen and play. But at the same time, I always hate, okay, I'm going into the menu and it's like, oh, okay, well, I just changed out my weapons. Now you're changing out your weapons. Yeah, that's always been a very, very annoying part of Diablo when you're playing couch co-op. But, you know, we made it work. We played for,
but worth it.
100 plus hours.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Exactly. I think I've solved Diablo 3 times, and it's always been co-op. There are a handful of quality of life improvements that they're going to put into this version of Diablo 2 that, you know, just because over time, you know, we don't have the patience to have to want to click on every piece of gold. So now all you have to do is get near the gold. It'll auto pick up stuff like that. You're going to have a shared stash space, so you don't have to have an army of mule characters, which I had in Diablo 2. So that's going to be gone. And interestingly, they're going to have an early access technical alpha coming to PC soon. You know, I don't know what soon means, but we may have the opportunity to start playing this on PC sooner than later.
Yeah, so that implies we're probably going to get this before Diablo 4, which totally makes sense, right? Like, send people back in time, give them the classic that they love, one of the best games ever made, and then hopefully come back in a bigger and maybe even better way with Diablo 4.
So I polled my Twitter followers yesterday and asked, 20 years after its original release, Diablo 2 is being remastered by Blizzard with new graphics and crossplay. By the way, they didn't call it crossplay. They called it cross, like, I don't know, saves.
They got a new buzzword.
Yeah. And
cross saves allows you to carry your save over to whatever.
But it isn't that either. So I need to learn a little bit more about what exactly, if it really has full crossplay or not. But I asked people, what's your level of interest? The options on my poll were can't wait, meh, zero interest, and then what's Diablo? I was a little disheartened to have what's Diablo win, and meh came in second. The only 16% of my followers had a can't wait on Diablo 2.
Yeah, I really can't wait. Like, why not? Like, I mean, yes, it'd be great to just keep playing new games and having new experiences, but I have such fond memories of playing this game with friends, and to be able to do that again with new friends as well, and in a bigger, better way, I'm all about it. Especially now that we're still sheltering in place, I'm all about a new Diablo in my life.
The PS5 controllers are having trouble with drifting, much like the Nintendo Switch controllers had, and there's been a class action lawsuit against Sony related to the joystick drift issue. What are your thoughts on this, and how widespread do you think this problem is?
I have not experienced it myself. I did experience it with my my Switch controller, and it was funny when you look at the Switch problem solving, you know, their solutions. It's like, make sure you're not playing in a room with an aquarium, and it's like, what?
Because of the humidity? Weird.
I don't know. There's just weird things going on with this technology, and Sony hasn't had this issue in the past. You know, not since PlayStation 3. It seemed like everything was smooth sailing on PlayStation 4. So for them to have it again, it was the Bluetooth on PlayStation 3 that would cut out, and your character would just start walking straight, and you're like, no, you're going to fall into lava. But, you know, it's out of your control. And Yeah, for
So,
drifting now,
yeah.
especially with the competitive landscape as it is, where people are really into their online games and competing at a high level, it's unacceptable. So we'll have to wait and see what happens of these class action lawsuits, or this one that's there right now. Hopefully there's a software fix, but it doesn't sound like that might be the case. It sounds like it might be more of a hardware thing.
No.
So we'll have to wait and see.
It is. I think it is. So I watched a video with it where they deconstruct the controller, tear it all apart and everything, and they show you what is the problem, what's happening when a controller drifts, and what you could do to fix it yourself, if anything. And it turns out, for all the things that these new controllers do, underneath the thumbstick is the exact same hardware that's been used in lots and lots of previous controllers, even across different companies. The key hardware underneath it is really very unsophisticated and hasn't changed really very much at all. And furthermore, the company that makes the underlying hardware underneath the thumbstick only has a stated operating life of 500,000 clicks for some of the parts that are inside of it. And depending on what kind of game you're playing and how much clicking you do, that could be as little as 400 hours, Reiner. Which is, that's 4 Assassin's Creeds, and your controller's belly up.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out very soon, right, Charge?
Yeah.
Like people are going to be getting on that here. People play a lot of games, so we'll probably start hearing about that more and more with this first batch of PlayStation 5 controllers, the DualSense controller, in the coming months.
This company that did the deconstruction showed how you could fix it yourself, but you have to buy OEM parts to fix it, and you have to be comfortable soldering and taking apart circuit boards, and just way over the head for most people. So if your controller falls out of warranty and gets the drift, and Sony doesn't want to acknowledge it, then you're going to be kind of stuck with either having to pay to get it fixed, or more than likely just having to buy a new one.
Yeah, I think in most cases, people will have some choice words for their controller as they hold it over a trash can, and that'll be the end of it, right? Like, I wonder how many people will send it in to get repaired.
Yeah.
Opposed to just go buy another one that day, because you're in the moment of gaming and it's not working. Yeah, I've been there a billion times and have just run to the store to go get a new Xbox or PlayStation controller. It always sucks when that happens, but I've never sent them in to get them repaired. I probably should look into that, though.
Yeah, you figure, but okay, so now the new Sony controller costs like $80, so it might make sense to send it back in rather than just buy a new one. But controllers have traditionally been more like $40-50, and at that point, it might not be worth the time to be without a controller, pay to ship it back, pay to get it repaired. At that point, you may as well just buy a new one.
Yeah, it's $69.99, so $70, but
$70,
a pretty penny. That's a lot of money for your input device on a system.
It is a lot of money. Reiner, great job today.
Hey, thanks.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun. We'll be back next week. I looked at the calendar for May. We only have March. We only have one conflict with the Wild through the month of March. So plenty more Video Games Weekly coming up over the next couple of months. Reiner, we'll talk to you next week.
All right. See you then.
Bye-bye.